Greetings, and welcome to another Future Trends Forum recording. Now, this session is a dark one. It is a hopeful one at the end, but it is definitely one that deals with a pretty challenging subject. The idea this week is to consider how authoritarian regimes have been cracking down on higher education around the world, the structures by which they do this, and how and when universities comply, as well as how academics resist. Our guest is absolutely terrific. She's written a very, very powerful book, Policing of Higher Education, which I strongly recommend. And for the next hour, you'll see that we have a great conversation. She draws on a lot of experience, a great deal of research, and a lot of passion. And the forum community puts questions to her that really, really tease out this view and explore it in great detail. Unfortunately, I think this is a very relevant session. I think this is one that we want to listen to very carefully. And I hope everyone who is listening and watching is safe and sound in this pretty wild time. To welcome everybody, welcome to the Future Trends Forum. I'm delighted to see you here today. We have a terrific guest who has written a powerful book, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. For years now, almost as long as the Future Trends Forum has been around, we've been looking at the political threats and challenges to higher education. We've looked at that globally in terms of colonialism and neocolonialism. We've looked at it in the United States and in specific states. We've also looked at it across different topics, everything from climate change to racism and anti-racism. This week, I'm absolutely delighted to host Professor Darian-Smith from the University of California-Irvine. She's the author of a new book, which is called Policing Higher Education, which goes into great detail of exploring the different political pressures that are being felt on higher education. She connects all the global right-wing and authoritarian movements to how higher education is changing in multiple ways. She does so with an incredible amount of research as well as an awful lot of hope. So without any further ado, let me just actually welcome Professor Eve Darian-Smith. Hello.
Hello, Brian.
It's really good to see you here. Where have we found you today?
I am in Southern California right now, so it's not yet noon, but that's where I'm beaming in from.
And it is probably gorgeous there.
It is. I'm sorry to say, for those who are in other climes, it is beautiful and sunny and perfect.
Okay, well, we'll have to endure that for you. Listen, we have a particular way of introducing people on the forum. We try to avoid the usual academic obituary style of asking people to describe their lives, although your career is fascinating. But what we like to do is we'd like to ask people to explain what they're working on for the year to come. So what are the big topics and what are the big projects, either classes, papers, books, or anything else you're working on? So what's ahead for you?
Thanks, Brian, for that question. But also, I just wanted to say thank you for hosting me. It's wonderful to see old and new friends, and thank you for everybody for spending an hour of your time talking about this topic. I know I'm amongst a crowd that very, very finds higher education in the current political landscape very distressing. So thank you for hosting me. What am I doing? I am actually very busy on a number of fronts. I'm a fellow at the AAUP Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom, which has been an extremely interesting experience. 15 fellows. We get together very, very often, and we've put together a whole lot of resources for scholars and students who've been attacked. We do analysis of the executive orders. But I'm very much involved in that. So it's sort of very much policy and activist work that I'm doing. Certainly in my own campus, I'm very active in helping scholars at risk host faculty and graduate students from around the world. So the UCI, my campus, has hosted about 15 people over the last 3 years, which is really quite incredible. In terms of work, it's a sort of we're at a very sort of important moment, I think, in terms of thinking about the international attack on higher education and thinking about it as a global phenomenon. I think my next project will be really trying to deep dive into international law and its relationship to academic freedom, and thinking about academic freedom more as a human right. At the moment, the UN Declaration of Human Rights and other international treaties don't specifically defend and protect academic freedom. So academic freedom is really a derivative right under the right to education, the right to science, the right to culture, and so on. And there's a lot of very interesting regional coalitions emerging under the Scholars at Risk sort of umbrella in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and across the Americas that are really trying to think about international laws that would actually support faculty and students that are under attack from authoritarian leaders. And so it's a sort of a new moment in thinking about academic freedom, both as a human right in and of itself, but also how it can actually be protected when you're in a domestic national environment of extreme politics. So I think, that's my next, I've been dabbling in this, I've been writing about this, but I think that that's the next book manuscript project about how international law can really provide that kind of transnational framework to protect faculty and students.
Well, that sounds fascinating. I would love to see that. And that's just a daunting scope too. I mean, international law is an order of magnitude more complex than just even looking at Anglophonic law. And then all the different national higher education systems. I mean, in your book right now that we're talking about today, you do a great job of bringing in multiple countries from multiple continents, and you do that very, very effortlessly. I'm looking forward to this manuscript, and I'm just delighted at your ambition, but also your work on the Scholars at Risk, where the numbers of that will sadly be likely to grow.
Mm-hmm.
I I have a couple of questions to ask, and friends, if you're new to the forum, what I'm going to do is torment our poor guest with a couple of my own questions, but then it's over to all of you for your thoughts and your questions. So as we go, please feel free to start thinking about what you'd like to ask. And by the way, I haven't mentioned this so far. If you haven't already done so, just in the chat box, why don't you just quickly type in who you are and where you're coming from geographically today? I forgot to do that myself. I'm Brian in Northeastern Virginia. And we have my colleague and neighbor, Steve Forster. It is indeed quite soggy here. Um, the first question I wanted to ask, and this is a big question, but it's because the topics you described are so big. What are some of the, I guess connection is the best word. Some of the connections between the rise of these different right-wing authoritarian groups, or as I say in Hungary, post-liberal groups, um, and higher education. What are some of the ways those connections work? And I know you've turned in this manuscript before the new Trump administration, which has launched a whole amount of stuff. And by the way, if anyone hasn't seen it, if you're curious, I have a YouTube playlist of my video reports on Trump versus higher education. But what are some of these different connections? How right wing politics are now pressing on higher education?
Sure, it's a very good question. I think it sort of goes to the heart of higher education. I think as we imagine it, it's a very important sector in terms of promoting critical thinking, new ideas, new solutions to pressing, challenges, global and domestic. That higher education is a force of innovation, right? So then when you have a far right or authoritarian leaning government, one of the sort of obvious sites of attack, or at least trying to clamp down and control, is the higher education sector. So, while we've seen book bans across, K through 12 here in the United States, it's really higher education where research and critical thinking and then the next generation of thinkers is being processed and nurtured and fostered. And that means that for as I say, authoritarian governments, higher education needs to be controlled. And we see this historically, from the early 16th, 17th century, where the Catholic Church is trying very much to control the new emerging universities. And we see this more recently in the 20th century, where you have book banning and attacks on higher education in the First and Second World War. And then, of course, across Latin America, we can think of Chile and so on in 1973. But always there's this deep tension between a national government and its vision of what higher education should be, And typically under authoritarian governments, it's very much about cracking down of any kind of equity and any kind of inclusivity in society. It's about creating a centralized and small autocratic central power. And so universities, which are really a decentralized, and colleges, decentralized modes and institutions of nurturing critical thinking, really are a thorn in the side of far-right governments around the world. I argue in the book that we're facing a unique historical point, because while the United States, just like many other countries, have historically faced moments of governmental intervention into university and college life, what we're facing today is this happening on a global scale, right? We're seeing a global drift towards the far right, whether it's across the Americas, across Europe, across the Southeast Asia rim, and we're seeing a decline in academic freedom on all sorts of fronts in these governmental shifts towards the far right. So that is unique, I think, in terms of historical understandings of where we're at.
Now, is that because the different reactionary parties and politicians are learning from each other across national boundaries?
Very much so, I'm afraid to say, Brian. So, we tend to think in the United States, we're appalled by what has occurred, in Republican-led states over the last 3 or 4 years in Florida, Texas, Georgia, and so on. But what we don't understand, I don't think, in terms of the wider society, that what's happening in the United States is just mimicking and echoing what has been occurring in other countries for the last 10 or 15 years. So everyone now knows about Hungary, which had, Orban came in 2014 and immediately targeted higher education sector, right? You see this in Turkey, you see it in India under Modi. You see it more recently in 2023 when Milei came in as the new leader of Argentina and immediately attacked higher education through defunding, through challenging syllabi and what was taught in the classrooms and so on. So you see Trump and the mega Republican Party really playing up and mimicking what has been occurring elsewhere. And so that, this is part of the authoritarian, as people are saying, toolkit. It's about attacking unions. It's about taking away rights, political and civil rights of people on the streets. It's about, censoring the free press and the judiciary, but it's also about attacking higher education and bringing it to heel, as it were. So yeah, this is part of the authoritarian toolkit, I'm afraid to say.
Sometimes, Eve, when we're doing these programs, I feel like I have to encourage the audience to start responding, and that's not the case today because responses have already been coming up. A good friend, Phil Katz at the Council for Independent Colleges, says that he wants to recommend paying attention to Florida and Texas, among other states. Our mutual friend and editor, Greg Britton, says page 1 of the Authoritarian Playbook is attack scholars. And Keenan Salinero, my colleague, seconds your motion about studying President Milei of Argentina. Well, thank you for that concise and answer, a very dark answer to unfortunately a very dark question. If I could press a little further on this point, then, to what extent do you see climate change playing a role here? I mean, this may sound like a marginal question, but I think you in your book give this pride of place by describing how climate denialism and the power of fossil fuel industries connects with right-wing groups. Can you say a bit more about that, how that impacts higher education?
Sure. In fact, so it's a great question because before I wrote this book, I brought out a book in 2022 called Global Burning. And that connected the rise of authoritarianism around the world with the devastation of the climate emergency. And that book very much teased out the connection primarily with big oil companies, the big oil companies. We're talking
Yeah,
Chevron and so on.
totally.
who have been very much sort of in collusion with opportunistic politicians and supported those politicians rise to power for a lot of kickbacks in terms of deregulation of environmental protections, leasing out national parks and wild lands to big oil and so on. So there is a deep connection between, big oil, rising ecological catastrophe, and far-right political figures. In the context of higher education, I think that is also very, very important because as other scholars have talked about dark money that has been around amongst think tanks and conservative foundations since the 1970s and 1980s. These kinds of enormous pockets of money, Koch Foundation is very much part of that, are very, very influential, if not, explicitly participating in the energy business. And so they have very, very much invested interests in actually clamping down what is critically discussed about in higher education around the climate emergency. So climate science denialism, which you can see now with Trump taking away, or defunding NIH and NSF funding, it's really also about defunding any kinds of critical science around the climate emergency, because if no one knows that if we don't have data, for instance, around the climate emergency, then we don't have an emergency, apparently. So big oil and other kinds of multinationals, big tech, big banking and finance and so on, are all very highly invested in supporting far-right governments and their clamping down of critical thought. But very much climate emergency to me is a sort of bigger picture that we haven't typically talked about in the attack on higher education.
I agree. That's why I was so glad to see that you had done that. Thank you very much for that answer. I hear echoes of Andreas Malm's work along these lines.
Yes.
I have more questions, Eve, but I'd much rather hear from the audience, and their questions have already started to come up. We have one from our good friend Tom Hames in the Houston, Texas area, who asks this: in the U.S. system of higher education, as it mixes private and public institutions, is it more resilient to these kinds of attacks? Is the U.S. political system more resistant because of its free speech protections and general political culture?
I think that one of the problems that I've been seeing the last, unfolding 5 or 6 years is that in the public conversations, at least in the United States, there's a conflation between free speech rights that are held, under the Constitution and academic freedom. And so I think it's always really important, as many people on the Zoom today know, that we can't just conflate them as if they're equivalent. So that's just one thing I wanted to make sure that we flag as a particular
Indeed.
problem, and actually quite a unique one to the United States context.
Yes.
And I can talk about that and how it differs elsewhere, perhaps later on. But in terms of the public-private sort of influence within higher education, I also think that it's not unique to the United States, but it's been very, very much embedded historically within the United States higher education sector. To the degree that sort of provides cover or some sort of immunity, I'm not sure. I think, business, capitalism is always going to follow the money. And I am skeptical enough about capitalism really only sort of following the money on the greater part, and not necessarily stepping in and being a force of resistance against far-right intervention in higher education much at all. I don't know if that gets to the question, but it is a very interesting quandary, because when you have big business in higher education, you also make yourself very open as a college or a university institution to the driving factors of up and down markets and capitalist instabilities. And I think that, thinking about the global political economy as the bigger context in which attacks on colleges and universities is occurring is a very important dimension. And it plays out domestically, I think, within particular institutions in different ways.
in the second to last chapter of your book, you go into great detail about a series of right-wing funds, notably the Koch brothers funding institutes on campuses that sometimes have deleterious effects on people not working in those particular institutes. Um, Tom, as always, thank you for the great question, and Eve, thank you for that really, really good answer. Um, Speaking of the world stage, we have a great question from William Lacey, who asks what you think about China in this context. It too has seen significant authoritarian changes in recent years. He doesn't say anything more in the question, but I'm sure that you have a lot of thoughts on that.
So the China sort of question around higher education is fascinating. Sort of on one hand, the United States higher education sector has been extremely dependent upon Chinese students, international students. I was just talking before with you, Brian, that Australia, even before the US, was very, very much open to Chinese students. And in fact, Chinese
Mhm.
students was basically the financial platform on which higher education in Australia and New Zealand has existed for 3 or 4 decades. So, when you have now, visas that are putting quotas and making it very difficult for international students, particularly Chinese students, to come to the US, you're putting a completely different economic pressure on many universities and institutions in ways that I don't think people really sort of appreciate to the extent how much foreign student capital is really financing US higher education. The
For sure.
question, I think, was really about, the authoritarianism in China as well. I think China is feeling that they're going to actually lose out a lot with their students not being able to participate in higher education here. Uh, I also think that China, like, they may think that they actually will be able to receive some US scholars and students who may be fleeing austerity here in the United States. So I think it's a complicated question, China, and how it features both in our domestic higher education politics, but also in a more global sense. I think Chinese students are probably going to go to Europe a lot more, in at least in the coming
Mm,
years.
mm.
Um, but yeah, it's a huge issue, China, and that our relationship with it and its instability. So yes, good question.
Indeed a good question. Thank you, William. I'm hearing that from Hong Kong that agents are being asked to redirect Chinese applicants away from the United States and presumably also away from Australia, Canada, and the UK towards other countries. Um,
Yeah,
Friends, you can see,
just to say, Brian, on
please.
Hong Kong,
Please.
I talked to a colleague the other day. Apparently, the Hong Kong university system is now exploding. If anyone wants a job in Hong Kong, they're there to be had, apparently. So that's sort of fascinating because, you know, with all the student movements and so on, but now it is now a new receiving space for
Ah,
students.
that's very interesting. That's very interesting. Thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. William, did you want to say more, please?
Yes, yes, thanks, Brian. Just last year, Karen Fisher at this
Hmm.
with a
Hmm.
Center for Chronicle for Higher Ed and myself did a webinar on the authoritarian changes that are occurring in China itself, and it's quite a significant change under the current administration. And so we did with the Center for Studies of Higher Education at Berkeley. So if people are interested, we try to analyze a range of changes that are occurring in their system in China itself.
William, that's fantastic. If you could throw a link into the chat, I'd be glad to take a look at that.
It's available through the Center for Studies of Higher Education at Berkeley.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. And thank you for the question. And just to put aside a scurrilous rumor, don't cite William's excellent beard and mustache as proof that you have to have a beard to be on the Future Trends forum. That's but so I'm glad William, through your question that we're thinking through Eve's promise of considering this topic at a global level. And we have another question that comes along those lines, and this is actually more U.S. focused. This is from our dear friend Ed Webb at Dickinson College in Pennsylvania, and he asks, how should we understand Columbia's capitulation to Trump and Harvard's continuing resistance? The Palestine exception to free speech seems to be part of it, but does it come down to personnel at the top, presidents and trustees, or something else?
It's an excellent question, and it's a very difficult one to answer. It's complicated, but I think Colombia made the mistake. This is just, my sort of side opinion, made the mistake of thinking that they could deal in a rational, reasonable way with a far right authoritarian regime. So they thought if they could capitulate, that they would actually then be somehow rewarded or at least not treated so harshly, without realizing historically you can't actually work reason with a dictator. So I think Colombia is one of those moments of tragedy. I wouldn't, that being said, I wouldn't want to be a president of a college or a university faced with the kinds of pressures that everyone in those roles is faced with. At the same time, I think Columbia was a very tragic moment in the history of higher education in the United States. Um, and I'm pleased that Harvard has stepped into the fray. It sort of is fascinating how, for many people, Harvard's the big boogeyman, white elitist, historically very exclusive university and so on, has suddenly, for many, become a hero in this tale of attacks. And I think just the recent, Harvard sort of was more conciliatory about 3 or 4 days ago, and then they got slapped with another 400 million plus attack by the Republicans, and sort of highlights that you can never actually work in a negotiation of rational reasonableness. So I think it does get down to the individual presidents and leadership, administration leadership at universities and their particular pressures. Uh, Obviously, Harvard and private universities have different kinds of access to economic endowments and so on. Very different scenarios for small colleges, liberal arts colleges, rural colleges, and so on. So it is hard to answer this question because across the board of all the different kinds of colleges and universities in the United States, the majority of leadership has shown to be rather lacking. But of course, there are not all college presidents are so cowardly, in my view. But it is a complicated question, and as I said, I wouldn't want to be in that position myself, because I think each institution has its own sets of priorities and pressures. But on the whole, it is a rather sort of shabby moment in Colombia's history, unfortunately.
That's well said. Yeah, I saw in Pittsburgh there was a faculty protest, and one placard read, "Let's be Harvard, not Columbia."
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's become shorthand already.
yeah, and
Uh,
unfortunately.
well, thank you for the great question, Ed, as always, and Eve, thank you for that thoughtful response. We have a question from our great friend in Oberlin College, Stephen Volk, who asks, he's interested in the relationship between democracy, as in issues that are put before the voters, and higher education. He spent the morning gathering signatures to get a measure designed to repeal SB 1 in Ohio, what we've been calling the Higher Education Destruction Bill, and to get a measure designed to repeal that on the ballot in November. Often what we do in higher education is not necessarily appealing to voters. Not that the authoritarian shutting down of critical thinking is either. So why should taxpayer dollars be spent on studying poetry or Latin American history for that matter? And what are your
Mm.
thoughts?
So this is, to me, a sort of age-old debate in higher education, right? Between those who like to think of higher education as a place and a space for students to expand their thoughts and stumble across histories and poetry and really sort of let their mind loose in ways that they hadn't possibly been able to before, and to think critically, structurally about the world and their place in the world. Versus those on the other side who always want to say, no, higher education, universities and colleges should be all about skill set teaching, preparing students for the workforce, and so on. And I think that these tired debates need to be put to the side to a certain extent, because they're sort of create a binary that actually isn't the case, because you need critical thinking to think about new jobs and new technologies and so on, for which then you will need to have new skill sets, so that they're very much more entwined than people on that one argument versus the other like to present it. But I think, and I argue in the book, that we really have done a pretty bad job, I think, in higher education in sort of sending out the message to the wider society about what it is the common good for those who go to university or don't go to university, for those who are, working class, poor people, marginalized, why they should care about higher education. What does it do for them? What's the common good, right? And I do think that we in the academy have not done a very good job about telling the ordinary person on the street why the university system and all the innovations that come out of it is important for their life, connecting it to their actual well-being. That being said, certainly in the United States, the Republican Party has had an anti-intellectual political strategy and targeted the general public by actually drumming up this narrative that it's universities and colleges are elite, they only serve the elite, they have got nothing to do for the common good, they're too expensive, they're just well beyond what is relevant to the ordinary person on the street. So within higher education, scholars and administrators and so on, I think, have done a bad job, but they also have to appreciate they're up against a huge political narrative that needs to be overcome. And that's hard. And I don't have solutions for that, other than we need to think about how better to connect, medical research in cancer to, people's real life experiences. We don't do enough of that.
Well, I think you do have, in your concluding chapter, you do have some great ideas, which we're going to get to in a bit. So I mean, so is this partly a question of storytelling, that higher education has to get better at telling its story?
Yes.
Uh,
Yes, I think it does. Very much does have to get better. Actually, as a fellow at the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom, we've done all these um, sort of group conversations about how one could advertise the benefits of higher education. If you had to do like an ad, what would you put in it? How would you actually speak to the ordinary person on the street? And so it's not easy, but I think there are people trying to think about how to spin a better story.
I've seen some interesting efforts on that for the past few months. Right now, I'm looking at Harvard University's homepage, and
Huh.
the image on it, giant image, is somebody looking through a microscope, and the big slogan is "Research powers progress," followed by the phrase "Research at Harvard, from medicine to technology to education and business, touches countless lives, moving us closer to disease cures, next generation technology, and a more secure future for millions of people." Now, I'm going to imagine that was extensively
Yeah,
workshopped
I
at
bet
home.
it was. And also linking it to security issues is a very, very timely and good move on their behalf.
Security, science, business. It leaves out the humanities and social sciences completely, but so that's interesting as a focus. But those are the sciences; those are the ones that are being targeted by the Trump administration's grant cuts. Um, I mean, this is something that we've gone back and forth on for years on this program, is how to better tell that story. And I guess if I could put this as a question in the chat, if there better ways that we can tell this story? Are there aspects of higher education that we can emphasize? While people are noodling at that, Phil Katz has a great follow-up question. Again, Eve, thinking about your book as it intertwines academic institutions with global politics, this is really aimed right at it. He asks, are colleges really the target, or are they a proxy for all kinds of perceived elites?
So, I think it's both. I think that colleges and universities are a proxy for elites who are woke, who are too liberal, who are out of touch, who are trying to take the country into a multiracial, pluralistic kind of space. But I also think that the attack by Trump is on higher education, right? I think it's not just against Harvard, who's symbolic, but it's about dismantling higher education. It's a full-on assault on
Mhm.
higher education. So that's my response. I think it's both a
Mhm.
proxy for a wider conversation and a wider target of elites, but it's also about taking down higher education as we know it. I'm under no illusion there. I mean, and all you have to do is look at Hungary, you have to look at Argentina, you have to look at India. This is about taking out the capacity for people to get together, come together, think critically together, and basically challenge the authority of the authoritarian regime. So it's about a very, very deliberate targeting of universities and colleges as well.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great question and a great answer. In the chat, we have two answers back. One from Steve Forster is that higher education strongly leans left, so it's just about owning libs, in that great American phrase. So I guess Steve is angling for both yes and to Phil's question in your answer. Um, Phil also offers the best propaganda for higher education device that we have yet created, which is D1 basketball. And that's again just to remind everybody that's a uniquely American thing. No other country does this college sports thing, but that's an epic selling point for higher education. Mark Corbett Wilson out on the West Coast, near you, although the other end of the coast, I believe, Eve, says if he remembers correctly, Jacques Ellul says that people only need enough education to be able to be manipulated or socialized. So that might be the model they're trying to push for. Um, and Phil goes on by saying that universities have always been counter programmers, often very conservative in times of progressive change. Sometimes it helps take the long view back to the 12th century, which is indeed the long view for post-secondary education. If I could ask for you to speak to one particular topic, um, this hasn't come up in the chat, but this has come up in the forum. We've hosted several speakers. Your colleague Hank Reichman. We've also hosted Jennifer Ruth and Michael Barabé, Michelle Barabé, speaking about academic freedom. And you have not just one chapter, but throughout your book, you go into great detail, but trying to detangle freedom of speech as a legal concept, the conservative model of freedom of speech, and academic freedom. And I think you do that. It's a tricky, thorny subject, and you do a great job of really making that as lucid as possible. I'm wondering if you could speak to that a bit right now. Is academic freedom seems to be something which nobody understands besides you and Hank. I mean, this seems to be it, and of course Jennifer and Michelle. Is this a problem for trying to tell the story of higher education to the world, that this is a completely new idea? I'm sorry if you could speak to that a bit.
No, it goes to the heart of the matter. And even as a fellow in the Center for the Defense of Academic Freedom, we all say, let's not use the word academic freedom, right? Because we argue amongst ourselves what it is. So I really do think it's one of the biggest obstacles in relaying to the general public, but even to my own colleagues, what academic freedom is, because there are so many different understandings of it. As I said earlier, I think it's important to not reduce it to the freedom to speak, right, which is a constitutional right. And I can say under the constitutional freedom of speech, I can say that the moon is green, right? But in the classroom, I can't say the moon is green and have any professional integrity or be published. In other words, what one says in the classroom is very much a right of an individual instructor or researcher, but it's also a collective right that's fostered through professionalization of the academic disciplines and all the publishing and vetting and reviewing that one goes through to have the expertise to sit in front of the classroom and to teach and to do research. So I think it is a knotty thorn in how we talk about it, because it's hard in just, it takes a couple of paragraphs, right, in writing, and then a couple of minutes in talking to even try and pass the difference between the right to free speech, and the right to academic freedom. So I do think it's one of the biggest obstacles. In my book, I try to get over that obstacle by thinking along the lines of um, colleges and universities and faculty and institutions of higher education being very much more socially responsible to their immediate, constituencies within the classroom, the students and so on the campus, but also socially responsible to a wider societal constituency, that they have social responsibility and an ethical core to actually serve societies, not just the students within their institutional walls. And I think that, the way I present it, at least to me, when I talk to people, people get a sense of that. It's social responsibility to, nurturing the best for the common good, whatever that may be, whether it's in medical research or it's about understanding climate emergency or actually reading poetry and thinking through people's, travel diaries as they have traversed the world in very harsh times and so on. So I think social responsibility is something that you see a lot more talked about, interestingly, outside the United States in terms of higher education. So when I have traveled and to other countries and so on, particularly countries that have been formerly colonized, the notion of higher education as being a site of social collective responsibility for the wider society is right at the forefront. Higher education is, linked to liberation and freedom and emancipation from colonial control. So it's seen as a site of confrontation against a power structure, and it represents the wider society's capacities to think in their own language and in their own terms. And so, learning from how others think about the value of higher education, to me, offers very, very interesting lessons for how we think about it back in the United States as sort of a site of liberation from structural inequalities and inequities and racisms, and thinking about it as, being socially responsible, not just to my students, but to the wider society. I think is sort of at least for me, it's a more legible way to think about how to communicate the value of academic freedom.
That's a fantastic vision. And I have to say, it reminds me of one of the darkest passages in your book, where you suggest that should this reactionary tide succeed, then we will see higher education instead reproduce all these terrible biases and inequities. Uh, we had a lot of comments coming in. I want to share some of them, Eve, but one came in from our friend Carl Aho in Texas, who says that here in Texas, some of us are using the phrase freedom to learn and freedom to teach rather than academic freedom, because the difficulties people have with defining the latter. And Carl, if you still have time, can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Good to be with everyone. I
Good to
think
see you.
part of the concern is academic freedom comes off as something abstract or comes across as setting academics apart from everyone else, whereas freedom to learn, freedom to teach, I think are more relatable. It also puts higher ed uh, in alignment with some of the other K through 12 concerns we have here in Texas, such as uh, bans on allegedly obscene materials
Yes, yes.
like biology textbooks, potentially.
I love the way it asserts the word freedom, which is just a real win, and that appears in some conservative language like right to work, for example. Um, but I know you're in a hurry, Carl. I don't want to detain you too much. Eve, please, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say to Carl that thank you for bringing that up, because and your point that the freedom to learn, freedom to teach makes allies with K through 12 in a much more productive way, because the academic freedom terminology sort of immediately is analytically, conceptually sort of within, university colleges and research associated. So one of my concerns is that the higher education sector is not very well linked with K through 12, right? And K through 12 has had deep troubles, librarians, book banning, extraordinary attacks. So in my university, the notion of linking up with, Los Angeles Union for Teachers is sort of not there. It's not really talked about, and it seems to be a big miss in my view in terms of creating these deeper alliances and allies with other sectors involved in education more generally. So I greatly appreciate you bringing in, the sort of more expansive notion of freedom to learn, freedom to teach.
Oh, I'm really grateful for that. And Eve, just so you know, there's a bank shot happened in the chat where our historian friend Phil Katz said, "Isn't this connected to Humboldt's formulation?" And I had to jump, well, why, yes, that's cited in page 6 of your book. And Tom Hames could do our skilled pronunciation of the German if needed. Um, thank you, Carl. That's I think a very powerful way of telling the story, Eve. Um, well, I'm conscious of time, and I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to ask a question. So everybody, if you haven't had a chance to yet, please jump in. Either in the Q&A box or in the chat, and we'd just love to relay your questions. Um, I wonder if I could kind of turn this towards the last chapter of your book, where you talk about some of the things that we should be doing, and you've already been touching on a few of these. One is talking about partnering with K through 12, which is so vital, and I think community colleges already are doing that a lot more with their dual enrollment programs, which are so extensive. But also, you emphasize you've got, I think, 5 or 6 different models to follow, and a lot of them emphasize a social responsibility at a global level. You talk a lot about the global north and the global south. I'm wondering if you could just riff on that for a minute. If a way to defend higher education is by this kind of global responsibility, I don't want to mangle it. If you could explain that, please.
Um, uh, where to begin? I'm thinking that we sort of have to try and possibly reimagine higher education and its, historically its deep links with a nation state. Because if we're having a global rise of authoritarian regimes, I'm anxious to sort of think through what could untethering higher education from autocratic far-right governments look like. And so to me, that really opens up conversations about transnational intellectual scholarly communities that support each other
Mhm.
across national borders and are not necessarily always tethered to a spatial territorial site, as in the formal university. A lot of people have been talking about, we all know the terrible precariousness of higher education and how many instructors are adjuncts and on short-term contracts and are in terribly vulnerable political economic situations. And for those people, the thought of actually having part of or participating in some sort of transnational university that exists in which they could teach and converse with others from other parts of the world is very exciting kind of opportunity. You're seeing some of these networks emerging. For instance, like there's an international transnational universities in Pakistan that serves diasporic communities who have had to flee Pakistan. So there are these new interesting models of actually thinking about higher education decoupled, as it were, from the political pressures of national far-right governments. Also in that final chapter, I'm in talking about revisioning higher education. I'm very anxious that we think along these lines beyond the Euro-American Academy, which has an outsized impact on higher education around the world, across national borders, across inclusive faculty and student constituencies. But I also, picking up, Brian, your concern or your interest in climate catastrophe and environmentalism, I argue that we really also need to re-envision higher education to include our relationship, not just with a pluralistic humanity, as it were, but with the non-human world in which
Yeah.
we all have a deep embedded relationship. So, these are just my ruminations in the last chapter about how we could think about a better world for higher education that takes us out of this firing line of authoritarianism, but also creates a new, more radical envisioning of what it means to have higher education being relevant to all young people.
I was really moved by all of that. I mean, and for some of you, if you want to start reading the book, you might want to start with that last chapter, because it is so inspiring. I'm wondering your call for us to partner with the non-human world, which we sometimes just call the world, I found very, very impressive, and it reminded me of Donna Haraway's work, and of course
Yep.
you cite extensively, and you cite late Haraway, which makes me happy because that doesn't get as much attention as Cyborg Manifesto. And I'm wondering what might that look like if a university decided or a college decided to double down on that? What what might that campus look like if it really did take the non-human world seriously?
That's a great question. I mean, I'd have to think more carefully about it, but I think in the first instance, most classes could incorporate some kind of conversation or dimension of their teaching to include people's relationship with the environment, right? So whether you're in more science-based classes and you have an aspect of that, but all the political science classes, I mean, sort of we can't get around the fact that we're facing a climate catastrophe. And so I can imagine almost every single class having some part of their syllabus or their conversation engaging with how the environment is the bigger context in which the conversation needs to happen.
That's You'll get no argument from me here on that. That's I think in many ways the phrase I use in my book about this is climate change is the new liberal arts, because it is inherently multidisciplinary, inherently about critical thinking, inherently about communication and creativity. And I think in many ways that would be awesome. Uh, no, I don't want to hog the floor completely. We have had some interesting comments in the chat, a few threads. We have a few people working on the difference between sciences and humanities in this. We've had some people looking at K through 12. Mark Howard Wilson recommends Californian Robertson Jeffers' idea of an inhumanism. Oh, excellent, excellent, well, Mark, thank you. Um, and Usha Ren, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, Usha Rao, sorry, I didn't have my glasses on, adds this comment. The fact that so many of us graduate students who have not had a single required course on the environment or climate speaks to how lightly we take the subject. And I wonder, Eve, if is to obviously fossil fuel industries play a role in funding, but they're one slice of the economic pie. Why aren't colleges and universities taking that inhuman world or the climate world more seriously?
It's a good question, and I'm not sure how to answer it. I'm not sure. I think for many people, they think it's not part of what they can do. They feel, immobilized. It's just too big an
Hmm.
issue. Don't have to deal with it. But I don't really understand it. I mean, if you take the environment crisis seriously, though, it forces us all to have to change what we do in some part, right? Whether it's the way we eat or the way we drive or whatever it is. And I do think humans in general are not particularly fond of doing anything that involves change.
Mm,
And certainly if it actually involves change that's inconvenient.
mm.
So, I don't know. It is something this, and it's not unique to the United States by any means.
Yeah,
So
we're we're
it's
we're we're pretty good at not doing anything about that. I mean, but
the U.S. is pretty high on the science denial front, I have to
yeah,
say.
yeah, yeah. Well, we have a pause where everybody's brain is full. Everybody's thinking very, very hard, and I'd like to ask you to go a little further forward on the future. Um, Ken and Solinero, Ken, I don't know if you've had a chance to read the book, but you're speaking to a theme that comes up later. Ken writes this: We reimagine science have been looking at the divide between Western science and indigenous frameworks. We believe some of the separation of scientists from the system being studied is part of this. And I think, again, sorry if I get this wrong, that you call for pluralistic epistemology in higher education, that we should be open to more than the Western scientific capital idea. And I'm wondering if you want to speak to that just for a minute.
Absolutely. So in another world, when I was living in Australia, I was a lawyer and I was very, very active in defending Australian Aboriginal rights, mining rights against big corporations, big oil, and mining industries. And that work really opened my eyes to a completely different framework of understanding the Indigenous community's relationship to the landscape and how important it was in their everyday, thinking about past and present and future. It's a completely different cosmology and way of understanding life. And we certainly need to very much in the Western Euro-American Academy learn to appreciate the extraordinary depth of this different kinds of understanding and epistemological frameworks that we have typically dismissed and marginalized within the scholarship that we hold up as the epitome of what we're trying to achieve. So I do think that within the university systems, within knowledge production systems, we very much have to reorient our thinking to incorporate the marginalized voices that have so much to teach us in terms of living sustainably on this planet.
Agreed. Well, Kenan, thank you for mentioning that. And friends, if you haven't had a chance to read the book, this is a theme that Eve dives into. Um, I'm going to ask you a question that's far too large for the small amount of time that we have left. So please feel free to dismiss as much of this question as you want, just in the interest of time. Um, Looking ahead a bit, we've touched on a few different possibilities for where higher education could go. I'm wondering if you could give us a bad news, good news, or at least bad scenario, good scenario for where we might be headed. If we look ahead, say 5 years, um, where might the forces of reaction take us versus where might we take higher education in opposition to them?
So I think, I'm an optimist at heart, but I'm actually quite pessimistic for the short term.
Mm,
I'm
mm,
thinking that things are going to get worse before they get better. Um, and I think there's going to be a purging of higher education more generally,
mm,
whether it's done by defunding or it's done, whether administrators are participating in it or it's actually imposed by the Republican Party on colleges and universities. But in the short term, I think that we're in for very bleak times, unfortunately. But as bleak as it gets, I think that also then opens up these new conversations and about alliances and about reaching out to labor trade union organizations and librarians and transnational academic communities that can show us so much what they've had to deal with and how they've also responded under similarly very oppressive conditions. So then that makes me feel optimistic again, that the depths of where we, I think, are horrifyingly going will force us, if kicking and
mm,
screaming as we may
mhm.
be, to rethink how we build up new kinds of alliances and solidarities globally, that serve our local students, but also participate in bigger conversations against global authoritarianism.
There used to be this phrase, glocalism, which is
Yeah.
awkward, I love the sentiment. How you managed to intertwine that all. We friends, we have just breached the barrier of 1 hour, and we, with a great deal of regret, need to wrap things up. Eve, thank you so much. You've been a fantastic guest. Your thinking and your book are both just, I think, essential for higher education right now. What? How can we keep up with you? What is the best way to follow you in your work?
Uh, well, you're very kind. First off, I wanted to say the book is available open access, so I have Greg to thank for that very much. So it's you can download it and you can it's all for free. So that's a wonderful
Woo!
pitch that I wanted to just say. Pitch. I'm available on in email, I'm very good on responding. I loved being in conversation with people. So keeping up with me is really as simple as sending me an email, and we can always chat further. I love that.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. Well, I'm so glad to hear that. And I'm really looking forward to bringing you back so you could talk about your upcoming work, especially on global higher education and international law, as well as on your work with both for, academic freedom and scholars at risk. Um, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
But friends, don't go away yet. Just to wrap things up, we have if you'd like to follow our previous sessions where we've worked on everything from academic freedom to nationalism and higher education, just go to the forum website, forum.futureofeducation.us. We have sessions coming up over the next few weeks on everything from AI and finance and higher education. Above all, thank you all so much for this terrific conversation, for your great questions and comments. It's always a delight to think together with all of you. Please, everybody, take care, be safe, and we'll see you next time online. Bye-bye.